Field Survival Series. So the Field Survival Series is a series of single-day courses that allow you to not just survive, but really thrive in the wilderness. And kind of a limitation that I've seen in the bushcraft community or the wilderness survival industry is a lot of these classes are predicated on multi-day or multi-week training, which the great thing about that is you get a lot of immersion, right? You get to build a shelter and really test how that shelter actually works out for you as far as staying out in the wilderness. What you end up lacking with that though is you lack repetition, right? You might build that shelter and build it once and improve upon it, but it's going to be hard to repeat that unless you do that over and over. So what we do in the single day courses where you lose that immersion is you get the repetition, right? We repeat those hard skills as far as we ignite multiple tinder bundles to really start dialing in building a good effective fire when we need it now, right? Or when it comes to shelter building and tying knots, we do the repetition of the knots to start building the ability to tie effective knots, do the small hard skills somewhat to a subconscious degree. Now that's something that really, that type of skill only comes with time, but it's much like coming and training with firearms classes at Bull Creek. Is by building that repetition, taking that home and really dry firing those skills, that it will build that ability later, right? So with that, the Field Survival Series is currently made up of 4 classes, right? The first class is fire. Fire is probably the most useful tool that a human being has, and I would argue human beings just about anywhere on the planet, if you don't have the ability to utilize fire, then you're not going to survive in the wilderness. We've evolved that way, right? So during the fire class, go over the fire kit, what are the things that you should take with you and keep on you so that you can start a fire under any conditions as long as you can find the resources to burn, right? We go over those resource types, how to find them, how to process them to make them effective. We talk about tinder bundle, which again is one of those big failure points when it comes to fire skills, right? Building an effective tinder bundle that can ignite every time and can ignite consistently with whatever fuel sources you have. Go over different types of fires that you built or the fire lays. Several different types of ignition types, whether they be open flame, spark, solar ignition, and possibly for the more skilled students, we'll even get into friction fires, okay? And we wrap that class and any of the classes up in the Field Survival Series talking about emergency techniques, right? So if it was real bad, we weren't just thriving out in the woods, but if something happened that was a threat to my life, how would I use fire? One of the classic examples of using fire in emergency is it being the winter right now. If I went through the ice, got soaked, how do I build a fire that can get me warm enough that I can first survive and I wouldn't go hypothermic and fall out, but secondly, be able to dry myself out and dry out my clothing or my broader shelter so that I can stay in the woods, okay? That's the fire. The shelter class, we talk about exposure effects, which there's a little bit overlap there with what we do with fire. We talk about layering, which is really your first skill when it comes to shelter, is actually the clothes on you. This is my first shelter, my consistent shelter, right? And layering being a skill in of itself. Different types of footwear for different conditions. Site selection, if I was going to set up my shelter or build one, improvise one, where would I put that, right? And different considerations of that. We do a lot of knots. It's where a lot of repetition comes in. We want to be able to, when we're tired, cold, and hungry, be able to tie an effective knot without having to think about it or without having to attempt it 3 or 4 times, right? We talk about, we cover field expedience, stuff that you can make out in the woods in case you need more. If you brought a tent with you and you don't have enough tent stakes, maybe building or crafting yourself some tent stakes or some ridge poles. We don't get into building recliners or benches or any of that sort of thing, but the stuff that would be considered essential for setting up a proper shelter. We also go into waste management, how to use the bathroom out in the field. We talk about field hygiene And again, we go into emergency techniques. One of the classic ones with shelter is getting wet can be very problematic under certain weather conditions. Part of the emergency part of shelter is really trying to stay dry in the first place, so we don't necessarily have to create a fire if we don't need to get dry. Third class is the forage phase, right, or the forage single day course, right? During that we go over different water sources and how to procure that water, how to purify it for consumption, and we talk about the differences between contamination and purification, right? So contaminants might not necessarily be removed from your water if you're going to, say, boil it and try to take care of all the bugs that might be in it, okay? We go into wild edibles and medicinals. We go into basics of animal sign and spore, so you get an idea of what your neighbors are and who they are, what species of animals are around you. We cover animal communication, particularly songbirds. I find very useful in allowing me to understand what's going on around me, even though I might not detect what's going on or I might not see it myself. Understanding different contact or alarm calls from particularly songbirds can be very helpful in giving you an understanding of what's going on around you. We cover trapping, passive fishing, and hunting as far as procuring food in the wilderness. Now, from a survival standpoint, hunting, trapping, and even passive fishing might not be applicable. Typically, especially as Americans, we've got enough on us if we're just trying to survive that we can extract ourselves out of the woods and we can just not eat the whole time or just eat whatever we had on us. However, if you're going to thrive or you want to stay out in the wilderness or really be skilled, we really do start delving into trapping and passive fishing. And when it comes to hunting, you could actively hunt, but I would say you're doing pretty well in the woods if you're specifically moving about looking to hunt. Really, hunting is kind of an opportunistic thing under these conditions, and we cover all that during that. We'll also cover certain types of, for around here, the temperate northeastern woodlands. We'll talk about game preparation and transport if you happen to get some game, and the transport part being if you weren't going to use it right here and now, how would you get it back to your shelter or your campsite properly. We'll talk about the type of cooking and preservation that you can readily do in the field and how to store that stuff, particularly with caches. Being out here in bear country or even some of the smaller critters, coyotes, fox, fisher and weasel in particular, no matter where you put stuff, it's always difficult to try to keep them out of your food cache. So we'll talk about that. And in the later portion of the forage phase, part of the emergency techniques is we talk about tracking, we talk about minimizing your signature just so you're leaving as little impact on the wider environment as you possibly can, which to a large extent also facilitates the tactical side. Mobility phase, we're looking to find direction and distance, right? We're looking to travel and do that effectively. We'll go over primitive ways of finding north, and if we can find north, we can find our general other four cardinal directions, and if we understand the landmarks that are around us in general, we understand the terrain, we'll be able to navigate reasonably effectively. We'll go into probably the biggest portion is map and compass, right? We'll learn how to use a compass and join that with map reading to be able to very effectively and very accurately find locations on a map and being able to navigate there. And there's a land navigation course. We'll go over certain aspects of that declination where your compass, where it says north is, might not necessarily agree with what your map says. So how do you allow those to interface and line up your compass to your map? That's a big part of it. We go over route planning, right? The shortest distance from point A to point B is a straight line. Well, not in real life. in the tactical side of a lot of our shooting classes or whatever, you start to see that that's maybe not the case, and that's the same in land navigation. Going over a cliff isn't always the best way to get from point A to point B, and how to effectively plan a route and think ahead as far as your being effective and safe while moving. Route planning is a big part of it. We go over terrain association, and we also get into what I call rucking. So certain ways of wearing or using your gear, particularly if you're going to use a ruck, a rather large pack, if you're planning on being out for a long time. We cover those different types of things in the mobility class, because if your gear is weighing you down, or it's hurting you, or it's just not an effective or safe way of carrying things, then it's going to hinder you or prevent you from reaching your destination. So that's the basic rundown of the field survival series as it stands right now, the 4 courses that make it up now. We will be looking to add to that. We had a decent turnout last year for the field survival series, and this year we're really going to start pushing it. We're going to have more open enrollment classes out there this year for 2025. So appreciate you guys watching the video, and see you out in the woods.